void of space stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast and silent witness to the events about to unfold. The UHS Nightingale, a massive Deathworlder hospital ship, drifted peacefully through the darkness, its hull gleaming in the faint starlight. It was an unmistakable sight, marked with the universal insignia of medical neutrality, a sacred symbol that no civilized species dared violate. And yet, hidden within the shadows of a nearby asteroid belt, a predator watched. War Prince Zrask of the Kraxith Warband reclined on his command throne, his chitinous fingers drumming impatiently against the metal armrest. His compound eyes studied the holographic projection of the hospital ship before him, his mandibles twitching in anticipation. He had been told of Deathworlder resilience, of their unnatural ability to defy logic and survive the impossible, but to him they were just another species, one that bled and died like all the rest. His second-in-command, Commander Valric, stood beside him, his posture rigid with unease. The Kraxith were not known for their hesitation, but Valric had seen enough battles to know when something felt wrong. And this, attacking a Deathworlder hospital ship, felt very, very wrong. "War Prince," Valric said, his voice low and cautious, "I urge you to reconsider. We have raided many ships, many worlds, but never have we touched a medical vessel. There is a reason no one does." Zrask let out a low, chittering laugh. "Superstition and weakness. That is the reason, Valric. The others are cowards, afraid of whispers and myths. But I am not so easily frightened. The ships are never attacked because no one who has tried has lived to tell the tale," Valric insisted. "There are no records, no survivors, nothing but empty warnings. And that is why this will be our greatest victory," Zrask declared, rising from his throne. "Think of the wealth, the resources. A hospital ship carries medicine, supplies, and above all, personnel. Injured soldiers, high-value prisoners, perhaps even hostages we could ransom." His mandibles clicked together in satisfaction. "It is ripe for the taking." Valric clenched his jaw but said nothing. Arguing further would do no good. The War Prince had made up his mind, and now they would all pay the price for it. The Kraxith fleet began its advance. Their ships surged forward, slipping out of the asteroid belt and into attack formation. Weapons locked onto the Nightingale, targeting its engines, its shields, though minimal, as expected for a medical vessel, and its communications array. The War Prince was not entirely reckless. He knew better than to allow a distress signal to be sent. Fire. The first shots lanced through the darkness, striking the Nightingale's hull. Explosions rippled along its surface, but to Zrask's confusion, the ship did not return fire. It did not even attempt to evade. It simply continued on its course, as if undisturbed. Then a voice came through the comms. "Is the UHS Nightingale, a medical vessel under Deathworlder protection. You have fired upon a neutral ship. Stand down immediately or face the consequences." The voice was calm, unshaken. Zrask sneered. "Idle threats. Begin the breach." The Kraxith boarding pods launched, slamming into the Nightingale's hull with metallic thuds. The docking clamps engaged, cutting through the outer plating with precision. A series of hisses echoed as the airlocks were breached, and within moments, the first wave of Kraxith warriors poured into the ship, their weapons raised. Silence greeted them. The corridors were dark, illuminated only by the flickering emergency lights. The ship's systems were operational, but the atmosphere was wrong. There were no signs of resistance, no security forces rushing to repel them. Just empty hallways stretching into the distance. Zrask watched through the helmet feeds of his soldiers, a scowl forming on his face. "Spread out," he ordered. "Secure the medical bay first. Take hostages if possible." The raiders moved forward cautiously, their clawed feet clanking against the metal floors. Their breathing was steady, their weapons primed. They had stormed ships before, slaughtered crews, taken everything of value. This should have been no different. And yet something was. Then the lights flickered. A low, distorted voice echoed through the ship, reverberating through the corridors like a ghostly whisper. "You should not have done that." The first scream came seconds later. A Kraxith warrior at the rear of the formation suddenly vanished from the comms, his signal cutting off abruptly. His squadmates turned, finding nothing but a smear of greenish blood where he had stood. Panic rippled through their ranks. "Stay together," their squad leader growled. "Whatever it is, we kill it." They pressed forward, their movements more frantic now, their weapons twitching at every shadow. The air was thick with tension, the silence no longer an advantage but a curse. Every step felt heavier, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them. Then, the wall itself came alive. Automated defense turrets emerged from hidden compartments, their barrels whirring to life. The first burst of fire shredded through the leading warriors, sending them crumpling to the floor before they could react. The survivors barely had time to take cover before more turrets activated, cutting off their escape. Ambush. The comms erupted into chaos. Zrask watched in growing frustration as his forces were torn apart, their once organized breach turning into a desperate scramble for survival. He slammed his fist against the console. "Fight back, you fools." Then the ship's doors hissed open, and new figures stepped into the corridor. They were not security officers, not soldiers. They were medics. Dressed in combat-rated medical gear, they moved with the precision of seasoned warriors. Their eyes were cold, calculating, not the gaze of those who simply treated wounds, but of those who had seen battle, who had pulled comrades from the brink of death while under fire. One of them stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the dim light. His voice came through the ship's intercom, smooth and measured. "You have attacked a Deathworlder hospital ship." His squad raised their weapons, but they did not fire immediately. They let the moment linger, let the fear sink in. "You are not leaving this vessel alive." The fight that followed was not a battle, it was a hunt. The Kraxith raiders, seasoned warriors who had spilled blood across countless systems, were slaughtered like prey. The medics moved through the ship with deadly efficiency, eliminating intruders with precise, controlled strikes. They did not waste ammunition. They did not hesitate. They acted with the ruthless decisiveness of those who knew that mercy was a luxury reserved for those who had earned it. Rask's rage turned to dread as he realized the true nature of his mistake. The Deathworlders did not send unprotected hospital ships into space. No, they sent floating fortresses disguised as mercy vessels, carrying personnel who were not only trained to save lives, but to end them. "We need to retreat," Valric shouted, his composure breaking for the first time. Zrask opened his mandibles to snarl a response, but before he could, the ship's external alarms blared. He turned his gaze to the viewport, his stomach twisting into knots. From the depths of space, new ships had arrived. Deathworlder warships. They were not part of any known fleet, not military vessels sent by an official governing body. They bore no identifying insignia, no markings of rank. These were something far worse. They were retribution. The Kraxith fleet had seconds to react before the first salvos struck. Explosions bloomed in the void, tearing through their ranks with merciless efficiency. There would be no negotiations, no surrender, because the Deathworlders did not take kindly to those who attacked their healers. And now War Prince Zrask understood why there were no records of anyone surviving such a mistake. Because none ever had. The screams echoed through the corridors, sharp and raw, cutting through the sterile air of the hospital ship. Zrask had never heard his warriors make such sounds before, sounds of true terror, the kind that came from something primal, something beyond pain. His claws gripped the armrests of his command throne as he watched the feed from his soldiers' helmet cams, his mandibles clicking in frustration. "Status report," he growled. Only static answered him. The boarding teams had gone silent one by one, their transmissions cut off mid-sentence. The last thing he had heard was the unmistakable wet gurgle of someone choking on their own blood. It wasn't the sound of a warrior meeting an honorable end. It was the sound of prey being torn apart. Zarask's compound eyes flicked toward Valak, whose mandibles were clenched so tightly that they trembled. "Recall the boarding teams," the second-in-command said at last. "We need to regroup." "We do not retreat," Zask snapped. "We press forward. They are only medics." Valric turned to face him, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "You are a fool if you still believe that." Before Zrask could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life, filling the bridge with a voice that made his blood run cold. "You should not have come here." It was the same voice from before, the Deathworlder medic, but now there was something different in his tone, something final. Zrask's claws twitched. He had fought many wars, crushed countless enemies beneath his heel, and yet there was something about this voice that made his chitin itch. It was not the voice of a soldier taunting an enemy. It was not the voice of a doctor issuing a warning. It was the voice of an executioner. "Open a direct link to the remaining squads," Zrask barked. A moment later, the main screen flickered to life, revealing the twisted corridors of the Nightingale. The lighting was dim, the walls splattered with the bioluminescent blood of Kraxith warriors. And in the center of the screen stood one of his soldiers, trembling, alone, his rifle held in shaking claws. "Report," Zrask ordered. The warrior's breath came in ragged gasps. They're not soldiers," he whispered. "They're—" The feed cut out in a burst of static. Zrask rose from his throne so quickly that his talons scraped against the metal floor. He turned to Valak, rage boiling in his gut. "Send reinforcements. Wipe them out. Kill everything on that ship." Valak did not move. His dark eyes remained fixed on the now empty screen. "There is no one left to reinforce," he said quietly. The bridge fell into a suffocating silence. Then the alarms blared. "War Prince?" One of the bridge officers turned, his frills flaring in panic. "The Nightingale? Its engines are activating!" Zrask snapped his head toward the viewport. Sure enough, the once drifting hospital ship was coming to life, its thrusters glowing with a slow, deliberate energy. But it was not trying to flee. It was turning, and it was facing them. Before he could give an order, a new voice filled the bridge, deeper and laced with something cold and inhuman. It came from the Nightingale, from its main comm system. "Your forces are dead. Your fleet is next." Then, without warning, the Nightingale fired. Not weapons, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, a series of electromagnetic pulses erupted from the ship's hull, slamming into the Kraxith fleet like a tidal wave. Consoles sparked, lights flickered, and in the span of seconds, every single Kraxith warship went dark. The bridge descended into chaos. Officers scrambled, claws flying over unresponsive control panels. The artificial gravity flickered, causing some to stumble. Rask gripped the edge of his throne, his mandibles clicking furiously. "Reboot the systems," he snarled. "Now!" "We can't," an officer shouted. "They've locked us out." Zrask's mind raced. This was impossible. A hospital ship should not have been capable of such an attack. It was unarmed. It was supposed to be defenseless, and yet it had just crippled an entire fleet with a single strike. Valric exhaled slowly. "They were waiting for us," he murmured. Zrask turned to him sharply. "What?" The second-in-command looked at him, his gaze heavy with grim realization. This wasn't a reaction, it was a trap. They knew someone would try this eventually, so they planned for it. As if to confirm his words, the Nightingale hailed them. The main screen flickered and a face appeared, a human. He was not dressed like a soldier. His uniform was white, clean, the insignia of the United Human Systems Medical Corps stitched into the fabric. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his sharp eyes unreadable. He was unarmed. And yet, as he stared at Zrask, it felt as if the War Prince was looking into the eyes of something far more dangerous than any warrior he had ever faced. "I am Dr. Elias Carter," the human said. His voice was quiet, composed. "And you have made a grave mistake." Zarask bared his teeth in a snarl. "You think you can threaten me, human? You think I fear a doctor?" Carter tilted his head slightly, his expression one of mild amusement. "Fear? No, I don't think you fear me." His gaze darkened. "But you should." The lights behind him shifted, revealing the interior of the Nightingale's medical bay. Dozens of patients lay in suspended medical pods, some alien, some human, all being monitored with the utmost care. And standing among them were the medics. They were still, watching, waiting. Zarask realized, with a sickening lurch, that none of them looked afraid. They should have been terrified. Their ship had been invaded. Their patients had been threatened. Their lives were at risk. And yet they stood there, as if none of this mattered, as if they already knew the outcome. Zarask straightened, his voice steady. "Release my fleet, human, and I may spare you." Carter let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Spare me?" He leaned forward slightly. "War Prince, you don't seem to understand the situation. You invaded a Deathworlder medical vessel. You fired on those who save lives. You broke the one law that even the most ruthless warlords in this galaxy respect." Zarask growled. "Then what do you want?" Carter's gaze was unreadable. "I want you to understand something very clearly." He stepped closer to the screen. "We are not soldiers. We are not warriors. We do not conquer. We do not seek war." His expression darkened, and for the first time something cold bled into his voice. "But we know how to end one." Zarask opened his mandibles to retort, but Carter cut him off. "You want to know why no one has ever survived attacking a Deathworlder hospital ship?" Zarask said nothing. Carter's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Because we don't let them." The transmission cut. The bridge was silent. Then the power returned, just in time for the Nightingale to vanish in a blur of faster-than-light travel, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. For a long time, Zarask said nothing. His claws clenched the armrests of his throne, his breathing slow and steady. Around him, his officers stared in mute horror at their screens, at the sheer devastation that had been left behind. Valak turned to him. "Orders, War Prince?" Zarask exhaled, long and slow. Then he pressed a single button on his console, opening a secure channel to the entire Kraxith warband. "This is War Prince Zarask," he said, his voice even, steady. "From this moment forward, all Deathworlder medical ships are to be considered off-limits." He hesitated just for a second. Then he added, "And if any fool disregards this command..." He looked back at the now empty screen, at the ghost of the man who had just shattered his fleet without ever raising a weapon. "Then they are on their own." Days passed, and the Kraxith fleet drifted in the cold emptiness of space, a collection of disabled ships and broken warriors. The hum of life support systems was the only sound that filled the otherwise deadened air of the command deck. Zarask sat motionless in his throne, his eyes locked on the communications console before him. Though he hardly noticed it, his mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the attack on the Nightingale, trying to find some mistake, some opening that could have led to a different outcome. The reality was undeniable, however. They had been destroyed not by superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but by an enemy that was more patient, more cunning, and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The ship had been a hospital vessel, a symbol of peace and healing, and yet it had been transformed into something far darker, far deadlier. Zarask had underestimated it, and now his fleet was crippled, his warriors scattered, and his pride shattered. "You've been quiet, War Prince." Zarask turned slowly toward Valak, whose expression was one of restrained bitterness. The second in command had not left his side since the attack, and the silence between them was thick with the weight of defeat. Alaric's words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken truth. They had lost. The Kraxith warband had been broken by a fleet of medics. "How many are left?" Zarask finally asked, his voice low. Valeric's eyes flickered toward the damaged ships on the view screen. 23 ships are still operational, but most of our forces are decimated. We've lost contact with the rest of the fleet. Many of our warriors are dead. Zarask clenched his mandibles, an involuntary movement of frustration. "How could this happen?" he muttered, mostly to himself. Valric did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched his warprints closely, a quiet understanding passing between them. Zarask had been the leader of the Kraxith warband for many cycles, a ruthless, calculating figure who had never once faltered in the face of adversity. But now, there was doubt in his eyes, an uncertainty that Valric had never seen before. "Perhaps it's time to reconsider our approach," Valric said, his tone cautious. "The Deathworlders aren't like us. We fight for conquest, for blood and riches, but they fight for something else, something deeper, something more righteous." Zarask's gaze hardened and he snapped, "I don't care about their righteousness. We didn't lose because of some moral code. We lost because we underestimated them." His voice was a sharp growl, but Valak could see that the War Prince's confidence was fading. "We need to rebuild, War Prince. We need to regroup, to reassess. We cannot afford to make the same mistake again." Zarask glared at him, his eyes blazing with the fire of a leader who had just tasted the bitter sting of defeat. "We will rebuild," he said, his voice icy with resolve. "But it will not be in the shadows. We will take our revenge. We will make the Deathworlders pay for this humiliation." Valak nodded slowly, though he knew that revenge would not come easily. The Deathworlders were not like the other species they had fought. There was something unyielding, something terrifying about them, something that went beyond simple strength and firepower. The Nightingale had been a hospital ship, and yet it had annihilated their fleet with ruthless efficiency. "Have you heard from the rest of the warband?" Valeric asked, changing the subject. Zarask's eyes flicked to the screen where the remaining ships of the Kraxith warband still limped through space. "No," Rask replied, "and I don't expect to. The Deathworlders don't leave survivors." The silence returned, thick and oppressive. It was the kind of silence that could only exist in the aftermath of a crushing defeat. The once proud fleet was now a broken, scattered remnant of what it had been, and no one aboard the Kraxith Fury seemed to have any answers. Valric's voice broke through the silence again. "War Prince, I think we should consider another approach." Zarask looked at him sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "We can't fight them head-on, not yet anyway. We don't know enough about them. But perhaps we can find someone who does." Zarask's eyes narrowed, a hint of suspicion creeping into his gaze. "And who exactly would that be?" "A former ally," Valak said, his voice quiet. "Someone who's encountered the Deathworlders before. Someone who might know their weaknesses." Zarask leaned back in his throne, his mandibles clicking in thought. "You have someone in mind?" Valric nodded slowly. "A human. A mercenary. Once. He's been involved in several encounters with the Deathworlders, and he might be the key to understanding them." Zarask was silent for a long moment, weighing the idea. He had never been one for alliances, especially not with humans, but there was something in Valak's tone. Something that told him this was worth considering. "Fine," Zarask said at last, his voice low but firm. "Contact him. We'll see what he knows." Valric nodded and turned to make the necessary arrangements. As he did, Zarask's gaze lingered on the shattered remnants of his fleet, and for the first time in many cycles, he felt a pang of doubt. The meeting took place in the darkened hull of a hidden Kraxith cruiser, far from the prying eyes of any Deathworlder ships. The human mercenary, a grizzled figure with unkempt hair and a weathered face, sat across from Zarask. He was no diplomat, no ally in the traditional sense. He was a survivor, someone who had lived through battles and witnessed the unthinkable. "You're the war prince of the Cracksith," the mercenary said, his voice low but steady. "Didn't think I'd be meeting someone like you." Zrask eyed him with contempt, but he didn't speak. The human was a means to an end, nothing more. "You fought the Deathworlders before," he said, his tone direct. The mercenary nodded slowly. "Yeah, more than once. And I've seen what they can do." His eyes flicked toward Valric, then back to Drask. "They're not like anything you've fought before." Drask's mandibles twitched, and his voice became low and threatening. "Then tell me what I need to know. How do we defeat them?" The mercenary leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It's not about defeating them, War Prince," he said softly. "It's about surviving them. You don't fight them like you would a normal enemy. They don't care about victory in the same way. They fight for something else. They fight to protect." Zrask's patience was wearing thin. "I don't care about their motivations. I want to know how to crush them." The mercenary stared at him, a long silence stretching between them. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but with an edge of warning. "You don't crush the Deathworlders. You can't. You can only break them, or you can run." Drask's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't run." The mercenary nodded slowly, as if he had expected the response. "Then prepare for the worst." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "You have to understand something about them. They are not bound by any laws but their own. They do not fear death, not in the same way we do. They are relentless. They will never stop coming after you." Zrask's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. "And what do you suggest we do?" The mercenary's eyes flickered with something akin to respect. "You can try to fight them, but unless you have the same kind of ruthlessness, the same kind of resolve, you'll lose again." He paused, letting his words sink in. "My advice? Find another way to handle this. Find someone who can help you understand them better. And if that's not possible, then you'd better make peace with the fact that you're about to learn the hard way, what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Drask's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. His mind was already racing, his thoughts a blur of calculations and possibilities. The Deathworlders had beaten them once, but it would not happen again. He would make sure of it.